They're like, we're soldiers, we do what we're told, and we listen to the big guys upstairs. And you're like, well, what if those big guys upstairs are...
This book has a boot shoved down its throat. It fucking loves licking boots.
Big boot-licking book for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Welcome, friends, to episode 359 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm writer Luke Elliott.
And I'm filmmaker James Bailey.
And this week we discuss Robert Heinlein's 1959 novel, Starship Troopers. All right, James, we're the only podcast, I think, where you can go from a feminist literary horror novel straight into a classic military sci-fi, hoorah, masculine book like this one. But that's what we do, right? We bounce around a little bit. It keeps things fresh, and we have a wide range of interests and tastes.
Well, not to mention, this was patron voted.
True, this was a Patreon selection. Yeah. We shouldn't take all credit for that. That's true. Our patrons wanted this from us, and we're willing to do it.
I mean, I think both of us can say that we're familiar with the movie. I like the movie.
Do you have any memories around when you saw it originally?
Man, I would have been pretty young. I would say
97,
vaguely,
something like that.
Man, I would have seen it.
I think it's 97. Yeah. I think I saw it somewhere.
I wouldn't have seen it until like the mid 2000s probably. I would say around the time that I saw RoboCop, I saw this kind of stuff, like jumping into that Paul Verhoeven world.
Verhoeven, yeah.
I was expecting some more. I mean, I don't know a ton about Heinlein, so as we're getting into it, I know that he's regarded as like one of the big three of sci-fi. So that obviously,
three, yep. We've covered one other big three. Do you know who it is?
Is it so? There's Arthur C. Clarke.
That's it. That's the other one we've covered. And do you know who the third one is then?
And then the third one is Asimov, who we've talked about.
We haven't actually covered Asimov yet, to my memory. So
no,
at some point we'll get
Foundation.
To him.
We've talked about Foundation a fair amount.
We didn't cover it.
No, not yet.
Yeah,
we're talking about
iRobot. There's other ones we could definitely do. We just haven't ever gotten to it yet.
Coming into this, I just didn't know what to expect. I was like, okay, a classic work of sci-fi. I know that like there's some of this. I know from my perspective and people who have talked to that like there's some of these classic sci-fi stories that don't necessarily hold as much value in a way today. I don't know. Value is an interesting thing to say,
value is an interesting term. Definitely societally and socially things have changed a lot since 1959. And some of the values that Heinlein is espousing in this book are direct opposite of things that I believe. So I definitely found a lot of friction in the book, I would say. There's a lot of didactic passages, too, where he's, like, really laying out his philosophy. I assume it's Heinlein from what I was reading. It is likely him. He seemed to do this a lot. He had a lot of characters who kind of acted as mouthpieces for him and would just kind of lay down his philosophies. But his philosophies also changed a lot over time. So it kind of depends on, like, where you are in his career if you're trying to figure out like what he believed at that given moment, because sometimes his books even contradict each other, I think, across eras.
Yeah, I guess with the way that like the monologues were taking off, that was sort of what was rubbing me the wrong way, because I felt like okay, I can go along with the story, and I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, where like there was like a tongue-in-cheek commentary, like a Strangelove kind of thing happening.
No, none of that.
But again,
that's the movie fucking with you, because the movie is absolutely a satire. Right. Which I'm sure we'll get into. I haven't watched it in a long time. That's my memory of it. It's Verhoeven. He loves to do that. So yeah, this is pretty straight down the lane. Like, this is a book about a starship. What is it? Starship Troopers. It's about Space Marines.
Yeah.
And it is like, that's what it is. And it really establishes a trope, or a like almost a stereotype, or even like an archetype now, that became almost universal, right? Like, we've seen this everywhere from Alien. I've seen Aliens, the second Alien movie. Like, we've seen these Space Marines everywhere, right? Like, you got Halo. Like, tons of video games have been inspired by this kind of stuff. And this establishes the like baseline, what we're talking about. This is the standard, of what a Space Marine is.
Yeah, and it made me think about another project that we covered, All You Need Is Kill and Edge of Tomorrow.
Yeah.
Just the formulaic, like, sort of, I mean, that has obviously like the repeating sort of Groundhog's Day element in it, but like that sort of idea of like go out there and there's a bunch of action, especially like the mech suits that they're wearing.
This book is so influential that even if you haven't read it, you've consumed other things that were influenced by it. So you're even indirectly influenced by it without even knowing it. Like the Fallout franchise, power armor. This was the first that I could find, the first use of power armor in sci-fi. So if you've ever thought about a militarized force wearing big like exosuits, Starship Troopers, man. So we're talking about like a foundational novel that established so many tropes going forward. This is absolutely that, and honestly super influential, and for that reason, and not to mention just Heinlein in general was incredibly influential on many, many writers who are like currently writing, or the people who are maybe like a generation before. Like I know a lot of older generation people have a lot of esteem for Heinlein.
And I want to say, like, I know I said value a minute ago, but those are the areas that I did enjoy with the novel is like, and I didn't really contextualize until after reading it, like when this was taking place as a story that was written in the sci-fi community.
Yeah.
I was reading it as a modern reader, and I'm just thinking like,
which is, I think totally a valid way to read this book. If you pick it up today, read it as a modern reader, have a reaction to it, and then later you can kind of think about the historical context if you want.
There was a lot of things that it was bringing to mind for me, and I was surprised at like those areas I was engaged with, and then there would be these sort of classrooms that would where I'd be like, oh, you're losing me big time here.
We got to have like a long lesson about why spanking is good and how the reason for all of society's ills is that we stop spanking our children.
Well, and fundamentally, this story starts off with this premise that, like, if you serve in the military, it's a choice to serve in the military, and if you do, then you have, like, higher citizenship that allows you to
allowed
actually
to vote.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're not allowed to vote if you don't serve. Now, it is said that it's not just the military. I think there are other positions, but it doesn't really go into those. All we really see is the military service. Because that's what Rico is going for. But yeah, you literally have to earn your franchise through public service in order to be able to vote, which is a controversial concept for sure.
Very controversial, but like from in a quaint way, I can understand why. And this is why I'm excited to learn more about Heinlein, because I want to know, like, is this actually his feelings or is this commentary that he's making? And I can understand thinking like, it's such an important thing to serve. It's such a someone has to do it, and like it's like you're making the sacrifice for a country, but at the same time, like that's not what our country was built on by any means. Like our country was built on the idea that
in this book it seems like America was a failed experiment, and then we get this new version of Earth that has now embraced these values.
Which just incentivizes. They're like, we're soldiers, we do what we're told, and we listen to the big guys upstairs. And you're like, well, what if those big guys upstairs
This book has a boot shoved down its throat. It fucking loves licking boots.
Big boot-licking book for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. I can think of it as a philosophical exercise, but I think it obviously falls short of anything that we would want to do. And it's the idea of like a select group of people having the right to vote and everyone else not. No matter how you divvy that up, no matter, like, I've heard people talk about like, oh, we should only allow people who have like a certain level of education vote, right? Like I've seen people come up with all these different ways that we should divvy it up. The problem is, as soon as you do that, it just creates inequity, and it creates a schism in society of those who have enfranchisement and those that don't, and that is always going to be bad. So it's like, yes, I know that when we do democracy and everyone can vote, there's tons of people out there who you're like, I wish that person couldn't vote. Like, there's so many times that is true. But in order for it to work, it's like everybody has to be able to. Like, I mean, like, I know we take them away from certain people, like felons and stuff. There's certain... But like in general, and honestly, I don't know that we should do that. But I think there's more people who can vote, the better, and that's where I always stand, and that's why I always push back on any of these measures that are designed to making voting more difficult, because that's always a way to try and manipulate who's voting and who isn't.
Well, gerrymandering and like voting it's
a massive part of politics, right?
Threats
and that's why the answer is always just everybody should be able to, not select groups.
And also, like, it just turns into the haves and the have-nots, right? It's like, if you can't advocate for yourself, then that's what this country was founded on, was like pushing back on not being able to represent yourself and make decisions on what was going on in Britain. And I think like this is, like you said, this is like no way to run a country, because if you turn it into the haves and the have-nots, ultimately the haves are going to abuse that power, and it's just like that power does corrupt I don't care who it is. I've seen, like, we've just seen it time and time again. So it's like having the masses decide whether it's perfect or not is more equitable, like you said. So interesting kind of thought experiment with this story, but ultimately, like, it rubbed me the wrong way to the point where I was like,
a lot of sci-fi is that, right? Like, we're going to have a thought experiment about what if society looked this way. And I think that's a valid way to write sci-fi, and that's clearly what Heinlein was doing. It is interesting that he presents this as a utopian society. From all intents and purposes, everything has been solved by this system, and the only threats we have now are like bugs from outer space that we have to fight. But like our society, like we've beat crime. We're like everybody seems like bought in on this system. Then involves a lot of like spanking people, a lot of corporal punishment. Floggings are like a frequent occurrence. That apparently you just flog people and everyone stays in line. The threat of flogging. There's a long part that compares like humans to dogs and how you train a dog and how you have to train children the same way. It's really gross. And also super outdated. We don't train dogs that way. We've learned that it's bad, much like with humans. The whole rubbing the nose in it, like beating the dog. It's like talking about how you have to beat them harder sometimes to like really get the message across, even though they don't understand what they've done. And I'm just like, this is all wrong. For humans especially, but also for dogs. That doesn't work. We figured out that doesn't work. So many things like that I was having a ton of friction with. But like, there were things to like in this book. We're not going to sit here and shit on it completely, or at least I'm not. I have some things I do want to talk about that I liked about it. And I came away actually wanting to read more Heinlein. I want to read some from different eras, because one of the things that I did is I did a deep dive into reading about him, and there's so much that I still feel like I'm only scratching the surface. And one of the interesting things we'll get into is how his like politics and his outlooks on the world changed over time, and he has these different eras where he has these different notable works that I would be interested to like check in elsewhere, because this is kind of his most infamous in its like pro-military, like super right-wing, content. And not all of his books are necessarily like that. Yeah,
it's interesting to hear you say that you would read more, because, and hopefully it has to do with his background. If that's the case, I'm excited to read more if he evolved as time went on, because I didn't really like reading this all that much, and I wasn't thinking I wanted to read much more. So hopefully,
I had like an okay time with it. I felt like it was written in a compelling way. A lot of the technology was described in an interesting way. It's not a book that I read or that I would read for enjoyment, but it's more of like I like to know the history of the genre. And Heinlein's an interesting figure. It's like one of my dad's favorite authors. And he's just someone that like I knew next to nothing about. Has always been a name, right? It's just one of those names that you hear all the time. And so I just had a curiosity. I kind of wanted to explore him, and I'm glad that I finally read about him and reading about his background and some of his more notable works. There's a couple other in there that I will admit I'm intrigued by, and maybe I'll come away saying that I'm just really not a fan. And that's kind of where I'm at right now. But like, I don't know. I'm curious enough to like give it another go. If anybody like has any suggestions for Heinlein novels that might appeal to me, given all of this, definitely leave them in the comments below. I'd be curious to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I like to approach it from that perspective as well. Like, I would read more. I just don't know that I was like rushing out to seek more out. But I will be excited to see if you can change my mind on that based on like some of the background. But in general, like the influence, like once I understood like how old the story was, and once you say like this is the first time that like mech suits are showing up, like those sequences were like I can definitely recontextualize and think like, okay, if I'm a reader for the first time hearing about this kind of like the suit that's helping you jump higher and lift more weight and all this other stuff, like that's pretty cool. And I think that like I can definitely see an audience like being fascinated by that. And then this idea, like like you said, this is like so many video games, like Helldivers is the thing that's like most recent, like so clearly
really more
like,
the movie, because it's got that satirical vibe, tongue-in-cheek vibe to it, but
even just
you don't get that movie without this book, so it all goes back to this at some level. And some people have tried to say that they read this book as like a neutral book that like just kind of presents this society and these ideas, and it's up to you to decide whether or not you agree with them. But like I would say, like if you go back, if you like step away far enough from any book, that's true. But that doesn't mean that it's not trying to convince you, because I think this book is trying to convince you that this is a society that would work and that we should want it.
Agreed. And I think I could buy that more if there weren't these extended philosophical sequences of like him telling us what's what and how the world works.
And like a
stuff.
student asking a question and then being like, that's a silly question, let me tell you why, you know? Like,
and also like just in general, like there wasn't a counter, there was no voices of dissent in this entire story.
Hardly
like it was
any,
like,
for sure.
I'm sitting here going like, what about this? Like, you know, they'll present something and I'm like, well, I disagree. What about this, and this? And everyone's like, well, this is they whatever it is, they've just drank the Kool-Aid and they're all happy with it. And I think there is a commentary on the military here in a sense too that I think we can talk about. And it's just like we've talked about it before too. And it's like, you know, genuinely like there are times that conflict comes and like someone has to perform those roles. And I think like that is to be lauded, but unfortunately there is also a side to the military at times that can get to be where this story, while being maybe a little farther in some ways, it can be kind of you know, controlling, changing hearts and minds for maybe not for the better, and like, you know, imposing trauma on young people and like
a lot of that,
you know,
that's how you learn, James. That's how you learn. So I think there is a sort of a heart of this novel revolves around this, I would say, myth of the sort of perfect military system, the perfect military man, the good man in charge of a bunch of younger or more inexperienced guys who need to learn to become men, right? And like everything they do is for their own benefit. I only hurt you because it's for your own good. I'm teaching you how to be a warrior. And like a lot of this stuff like has kernels of truth, obviously. This is what a lot of these systems are founded on. But like also so many times we've seen abuses of this and people in positions of power who don't have the best interest in mind and like get off on it. And he just kind of like brushes that all aside. You know, those people don't get to keep their positions and they've kind of figured it all out. But this all just goes back to the idea of the just state, right? The good king who has the best interest in everybody's mind. And as long as you have a good position in power, you have a good person in power, then, you know, strict authoritarian rule is a good thing, because then you have nobody get in your way. And like that kind of trickles down throughout this book of like just people in power aren't to be questioned because they have our best interests at heart. And time and again, we see examples of exactly that, where like commanding officers are shown to be really good guys who are like hate to do this, but like, you know, it's for your own good, and we're actually teaching you a lesson, and you know, you come to respect them for that, even though you didn't like them at first. Like it's so many times that's how these characters are presented. Yeah,
and not to mention, like I think if you ask most people right now if they would feel comfortable with this system being implemented, I think regardless of political affiliation in our country right now, I think everybody would say it would be a bad idea, because we're not seeing just leaders and all this. And I think that's something that like our country went through, you know, with like Watergate and like the disillusion, like the distrust in the government that we saw maybe post this story being written, where it's just like I don't feel comfortable in any way not having watchdogs in place and not having like systems that prevent
certainly people on our side of the aisle would agree with that. I don't know anymore what to expect. So that's the other thing I was going to say. To me, this is like yes, this guy is like, I think clearly at this stage in his life, pretty right wing, especially by today's standards. But this is like a version of that, of like republicanism, if I can, that like doesn't seem to exist anymore to me, or has been drummed out of their party. I know we're getting pretty modern political when I say that, but like this is the kind of Republican that like I grew up believing was what this meant. Like, you know what I mean? Like one thing about Heinlein is like he still believes in like equal opportunity for different races, and like he has, I would argue, some sexist beliefs. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't seem rooted in misogyny as much as it's just like just a lack of understanding. And he's sort of got these preconceptions that he grew up with. And this is stuff that occurs throughout his his books that I've read about. Only some of that is even present here, but like you could see some of it. This isn't a guy who was like to me, it didn't seem like he like had all this hatred. And really truly thought like the white man was better than everybody else. And in fact, some of his books, like he elevates women to statuses of power, like he has them be judges and lawyers and stuff. Like he almost elevates them above men. But still, even that, it's kind of a benevolent sexism where he like just thinks that they're different and they're just like fundamentally different than men, and so should have a different role in society. Anyway, and it's not saying that like this is good, but like this was kind of the like thing I was sold early on in my life when I was growing up in the South and around a lot of right-wing people. And like I just don't recognize that anymore in today's politics. I think that is gone. It's been abandoned.
Well, I think in recent years too, right? Basically with the onset of like Drain the Swamp, Donald Trump, 2016, because we saw. I mean, we're literally talking about a person who goes around touting that like he loves the military and all this other stuff, and constantly like strips back like benefits for veterans and doesn't
never
like,
served.
Actively,
so by the way, in this version of society, would not be allowed to be a politician.
Yeah, actively avoided service, and like for whatever reason, the party and some of the people who serve in the military have chosen to follow him. But there have been generals and all this other stuff that like didn't agree with him on a lot of the different things that he's done, and ultimately you're getting what we're seeing now in almost every position is just like a removing of those people that disagree and putting in yes men all over the place. So it's like it's crazy to think of it in this context, and this is like where the slippery slope can be introduced with something that's like a utopia in Heinlein's eyes in this story, where it's like but we just can't. There has to be a certain level of skepticism in today's world, and I think even then there should have been.
Yeah, and we don't know. Like I think he died in the late '80s, so we have no idea how he would have aligned were he's still alive today somehow. But to me, like this is a guy who loved competent men. This like his number one hero throughout all of his fiction was like the competent man or competent young man who grows into a competent man, right? It's the character who is smart, who is resourceful, who is usually good looking, can fight. He's kind of the aspirational guy who then just like flourishes in a role, like flourishes in this new position that he's entering into. This is a character he came to time and time again because he loved competency. He really valued knowledge. He valued people who knew what they were talking about. I think that's in conflict with a lot of what I'm seeing today, where we're at least on the right, we're seeing a lot of people who hate people who have expertise, right? Who have knowledge, who are college educated, who have technical skill. It's like they don't like any of that. In fact, they think that we should elevate a bunch of people who have absolutely no experience and don't know what they're doing at all to be heads of a lot of different pieces of our government. So anyway, I mean, we're not going to be able to talk about Starship Troopers without having a little bit of political diatribes in here. Heinlein would approve. That's how he wrote his books. Right? Like he had his long character parts where he would espouse his politics. So I think a little bit of that is okay.
Yeah. Bug sort of invaders and the like there's no nuance to this, right? They're evil, they're coming and they're destroying.
They're communists.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. They're compared unfortunately to communists and to certain socialist or communal movements.
Because they're like I don't know if
they're a hive mind.
They're a hive mind, yeah.
They don't care about individual workers. They only care about like the brain bugs and stuff. Whereas like we humans in this military force care about every man and won't leave him behind. So he's definitely drawing some parallels there. I think metaphorically, you take from that what you will.
I just think it's interesting to have this as the threat, right? That there's no we don't know. There's no sense of negotiation. It's just battle. It's just half.
And although they do seem to have more of a society than I remember in the movies, at least like this, there are like workers and they have like cities and they have technology. Reminds me a little bit more of almost like what is it, the Flood or whatever, and like Halo. There's a kind of a bug race of aliens that you fight. That have a little more tech, and that's kind of what I was kind of picturing here. But like, it's not really super clear what kind of tech they really have. All right, man. So if you're ready, I think let's talk about Robert Heinlein, the author. I got a lot of stuff in here that I can't go over all of it, so this will just be kind of like the stuff that stood out to me of interest. We'll probably revisit Heinlein at some point in the future. He does have other adaptations that have been made. Also, there's another Starship Troopers adaptation getting made at some point here that I've heard about. In theory, we'll see if it actually comes out. So definitely more opportunities to return to him. But we'll just give you a little starter pack on Heinlein. So Robert Anson Heinlein was born in 1907. He was an American science fiction author, aeronautical engineer, and naval officer, sometimes called the Dean of Science Fiction Writers. He was among the first to emphasize scientific accuracy in his fiction and was thus a pioneer in the subgenre of hard science fiction. So you can definitely say like Jules Verne led to Heinlein in some ways, right?
Wow.
He really cared about scientific accuracy, and he kind of popularized this subgenre. His published works, both fiction and nonfiction, express admiration for competence and emphasize a value of critical thinking. His plots often pose provocative situations which challenge conventional social mores. His work continues to have an influence in the science fiction genre and on modern culture more generally. I would say that's still true. It does feel to me like he's not being read as much these days. I think just because a lot of these books feel very of the time, and have sort of been moved on from. Maybe not forgotten, but moved on from.
That is something interesting though with very influential stories, right? It's like once the baton has been passed, it's interesting to see sometimes that like people would rather return to or engage with like some of the I guess children of those stories.
Yeah, for sure, man. There was a lot of stuff that would be written sort of in response to his work and that of his big three. So let's talk about the big three. Heinlein, Isaac Asimov, and Arthur C. Clarke are often considered the big three of English language science fiction authors. Notable Heinlein works include Stranger in a Strange Land,
Wow,
Starship Troopers, and The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. So these sometimes included some controversial aspects such as plural marriage in The Moon is a Harsh Mistress and militarism in Starship Troopers. And he was also known for having technologically competent women characters who were formidable. However, they were often still stereotypically feminine. So it's one thing to note that this is something that I was reading is present in a lot of his fiction, that he had women who were like active in society, often technologically competent, educated, and yet he would still present them in very stereotypical sexist ways. But still, we're talking somebody who started publishing in the 30s. So this was actually considered quite progressive to have women showing up at all, much less have technical competency. This is a time where, he grew up and was born in 1907. Women didn't have the right to vote. Like, they didn't hold positions of power in government. Like, this was all new as he was going through his life. So, I guess it's like I want to like put it in context for the time in which this guy was living in.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. And like I noticed kind of something I like rolled my eyes at, where it was like the women are pilots often in this story. And
it's a key example of his like benevolent sexism, right?
Yeah. So like they're like badass pilots, and they're like dropping in these people, and there's a few moments where like this character
they're supposed to have like better reflexes, I think, and like certain
saving
kinds
the day,
of intelligence that works better for being a pilot.
Yeah, and our main character Rico like has thoughts sometimes where he's like, oh, I would trust her with anything, and she saved the day. She swooped in and saved us. But then there's also like at the very beginning, there's like a comment that's made that's like basically along the lines of like women are bad drivers or something like.
Yeah, because like, about the same thing with pilots. He's like, all that may be true, yet they fly rough, and they're really they. It's like no matter what, they're still going to be considered bad drivers, I guess. Yeah, and I caught that too. It's he can't quite get out of his own way. I think a little bit like he's got to objectify them. Like this guy clearly. Really loved women, and from what I was reading, that is true throughout his life. But like, I think in some ways that his attraction and his like need to objectify gets in his way at like really viewing them as people. But that's just armchair psychologist over here. So Heinlein was named the first science fiction writer's Grand Master in 1974. 4 of his novels won Hugo Awards. In addition, 50 years after publication, 7 of his works were awarded Retro Hugos, awards given retrospectively to works that were published before the Hugo Awards came into existence. I think that's still a record, actually, from what I was seeing, unless it recently got changed. But at the time in which I was watching this video talking about it, said it was a record.
Wow.
As far as like number of Hugos won. I'm not going to get too much into his family life. He was born in Missouri. He was the third of 7 children. I think it's worth noting he was a 6th-generation German-American who came from a family tradition that had one of the Heinleins fought in every American war, starting with the War of Independence. So he is literally that character from Forrest Gump. What is it, Lieutenant Dan?
Yes.
That's Heinlein. So you can understand, like, that should give you some context, right? And this guy ends up going into the military. This gives you context of him coming up with this idea that only people who serve in the military should have the right to vote. He comes from a family of veterans, and he has grown up around it. He's always valued it, and in fact, like, I would say it is central to who he is. This is something that he really, really cares about. He would spend his childhood in Kansas City. The Bible Belt, he said, had an influence on his fiction. Yeah, so when he was 16 years old, he would enlist in the 110th Engineer Regiment of the Missouri National Guard. Oh, he was initially prevented from attending the United States Naval Academy because his older brother Rex was a student there, and at the time, regulations discouraged multiple family members from attending the academy simultaneously. So instead, he matriculated to the Kansas City Community College and began vigorously petitioning Missouri Senator James Reed for an appointment in the Naval Academy. They eventually did admit him in 1925. He received his discharge from the Missouri National Guard as a staff sergeant. Reed later told Heinlein that he had received 100 letters of recommendation for nomination to the Naval Academy, 50 for other candidates, and 50 for Heinlein. So apparently quite popular. A lot of people were recommending him. He would go on to serve in the U.S. Navy, which would exert a strong influence on his character and writing. In 1929, he graduated from the Naval Academy with the equivalent of a Bachelor's of Arts in Engineering. He ranked 5th in his class academically. He was commissioned as an ensign shortly after graduation, advanced to lieutenant junior in 1931 while servicing aboard the aircraft carrier, the USS Lexington, where he worked in radio communications. Heinlein also served as a gunnery officer above the destroyer, the USS Roper, in 1933 and 1934, reaching the rank of lieutenant. So in his personal life, he would marry Eleanor Curry of Kansas City, but their marriage would only last about a year. And then his second marriage to Leslyn McDonald would go on 15 years. And according to the testimony of Heinlein's Navy friend, she was astonishingly intelligent, widely read, and extremely liberal, though a registered Republican. While Isaac Asimov later recalled that Heinlein at the time was a, quote, flaming liberal. So this is his liberal period in the 20s and 30s when he was married to this woman. It seems like at least moderate, right, compared to what he would later become. And then also, like, think about this. This is the start of World War II. This is a very dramatic time in the world, and definitely if you're in military service.
Yeah, I would love to know what flaming liberal looks like in like 1930s.
Yeah, in 1930s, like what does that look like?
I have no idea.
That is a good question. So, in 1934, he would be discharged from the Navy owing to pulmonary tuberculosis. And during a lengthy hospitalization, was inspired by his own experience while bedridden. He developed a design for the modern waterbed. So if you've ever slept on a waterbed, which is very uncomfortable in my opinion, Robert Heinlein, he designed the modern waterbed. So that's
wild. That's a crazy random anecdote.
Yeah, right. There's a few of those kind of random anecdotes here. So after his discharge, he attended a few weeks of graduate classes in mathematics and physics at the University of California, Los Angeles, but he soon quit either because of his ill health or his desire to enter politics. He had several different occupations: real estate, sales, silver mining. He was active in Upton Sinclair's Socialist in Poverty in California movement, worked actively in the campaign for Sinclair when he was trying to go for the Democratic nomination for the governor of California. And Heinlein himself ran for the California State Assembly in 1938, but was unsuccessful. He was running as a left-wing Democrat in a conservative district and was defeated in the Democratic primary by less than 500 votes. So again, this was a different period in his life politically. Now, during this time, he started really his authorial life. His first published short story was called Lifeline, which was printed in the August 1939 issue of Astounding Science Fiction. He would later write a future history story called Misfit, and some saw Heinlein's talent and stardom from his first story. He was quickly acknowledged as the leader of a new movement called towards social science fiction. Just that he was writing about social issues. He was the guest of honor at the Denvention, which is the 1941 Worldcon held in Denver during World War II. Pretty wild. Just says people who just went to Worldcon. It's funny to hear about these like really old ones.
Well, it is funny now that we've talked about, like, you know, we've know people who've been nominated for Hugos and won Hugos, and like just the legacy of that is really wild to think about, like how far back this goes. And so, I mean, it's just interesting because you were talking about the big three, and we're talking about like it sounds like they dominated the Hugos for, you know, quite a period of time, and then like we're covering Heinlein now, and just to put it all into context and have that puzzle piece filled in. Like, I know you often say this about certain films and the way that they connect, but like going this far back and seeing like where sci-fi's come, even this is like, you know, our grandparents' generation. Like, it's not really that far back, and when you think about it. But to see like how far storytelling has come, and to see like these, you know, Worldcon, for example,
maybe
how
like
large.
one generation past grandparents, I would say. He's like great grandparents for me.
Okay. But if you think like your grandparents were
born
you're
in the
right,
20s.
Yeah, that's true.
And like he was born in 1907. So 20 years before. I think he's one generation past that. He's like my great grandparents, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like it's more distant than I thought, but also like more modern than I thought. You know what I mean? Like there's like he lives into the 80s, so like
it's just relative. Yeah, it's relative to a lot of that kind of thing. So yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? So I think one note here I saw is that he began work as a civil aeronautical engineer as a civilian for the Navy Aircraft Material Center and the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard in Pennsylvania. While there, he recruited Isaac Asimov and L. Sprague de Camp to work there. Sprague de Camp, is that an author? Yeah, that's another author. I don't know his work. But so he got them all to work there, and while there, the three of them brainstormed unconventional approaches to kamikaze attacks, such as using sound to detect approaching planes. So trying to defend against kamikaze attacks. Wow. So him and these other sci-fi writers like start working as civilians to help out with the war, World War II. So
it is also interesting too, like that during this era, they're like, you know, they're inventors and they're scientists and a lot of that. I'm sure that still does go on, but nowadays,
I mean, he's literally an engineer.
It's not a prerequisite these days, though, to be a sci-fi writer. You don't have to have that kind of background.
Agreed.
So it is interesting to like think of course, these people would start thinking out of the box and probably would be a fan of other sci-fi writing, and would be inspired, and, you know, then would go on to inspire so much.
Yeah. So I'll back over to his personal life real quick. Because while at that Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, he met and befriended a chemical engineer named Virginia Jenny Gerstenfeld. After the war, her engagement having fallen through, she attended UCLA for doctoral studies in chemistry, and while there, reconnected with Heinlein. As his second wife's alcoholism gradually spun out of control, Heinlein moved out, and the couple filed for divorce. His friendship with Virginia turned into a relationship in 1948. They married and moved to a town in New Mexico. So she was who he was with for the rest of his life, from what I was able to see, and would heavily influence a lot of his writing going forward, because she was like I said, she was getting a doctoral degree. She was very highly educated, but also pretty right-wing from what I was seeing. So also maybe pulled him even further to the right. So, but he had a lot of respect for women who were sort of capable and knowledgeable, and I think a lot of that comes from his wife, or his relationship with his wife. Okay, so back to where we were. As the war wound down in 1945, he began to reevaluate his career. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, along with the outbreak of the Cold War, galvanized him to write nonfiction on political topics. In addition, he wanted to break into better-paying markets. He published 4 initial short stories in the Saturday Evening Post magazine, leading off in 1947 with The Green Hills of Earth. That made him the first science fiction writer to break out of the, quote, pulp ghetto. In 1950, the movie Destination Moon, the documentary-like film, which he had written the story and scenario, co-written the script, and invented many of the effects, won the Academy Award for Special Effects.
I didn't know that.
That's pretty cool. So this is like, he's starting to make the jump right here. He wants to get out of the pulp ghetto, as they call it, and start getting some mainstream appeal. He had been writing these juvenile novels, which we'll talk about, early in his career. They were literally written. This is kind of the precursor to YA and middle grade. It wasn't distinguished as like a, I guess, clearly, but the idea was they were mostly for kids, specifically young boys. So he'd written a series of them from 1947 to 1959 at the rate of one book each autumn in time for Christmas presents for teenagers. So this became a big thing in a lot of young boys' lives. They'd get the new Heinlein juvenile novel every Christmas, right? So you can see how there's a lot of people who probably grew up in this era who remember him for this reason. So in 1958, he interrupted his work on The Heretic, which was the working title of Stranger in a Strange Land, to write and publish a book exploring the ideas of civic virtue, initially serialized as Starship Soldiers. In 1959, his novel, now entitled Starship Troopers, was considered by the editors and owners of Scribner's, who were the ones who had been publishing all of his juvenile novels, and this was intended to be a juvenile novel. It was considered by these owners and publishers to be too controversial for one of its prestige lines, and it was rejected. This infuriated Heinlein. He would write to his literary agent and say that he didn't want to sell any more books to them. He had, been keeping them afloat, which, like, I guess one of the editors had actually told him, like, his books were, like, literally keeping them in the red, I guess, or in the black. I always forget what color.
I think in the black, yeah.
Yeah, one of the colors, the good one.
Yeah.
Anyway, so he was furious, and so he found another publisher, Putnam. And feeling released from the constraints of writing novels for children, however, he rewrote it as a book more for adults. But you can kind of see, I think you can still see some of the leftover like remnants of that juvenile novel that it began.
Well, it's at least catering to a younger demo, and it's a coming of age. Like
it's a coming of age
person
story
is
in a way,
progressing through the ranks in a sense, and then becoming like a man, like we've talked about. So yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to go all the way through his entire life, but I'll say that Stranger in a Strange Land, which would come out in 1961, was the book that really broke through to the mainstream. It was the first book to rank in the New York Times bestseller list that was a sci-fi novel, the first sci-fi novel to do that in America. I don't know how long that list had been in existence, but I was reading that. So this is considered the first sci-fi novel that truly broke through to the mainstream. And one of the reasons it did is because it was a book that included these plural marriages and sort of commune living in it. And so the counterculture of the 60s found and loved this novel. So if we think about like Ken Kesey and a lot of that counterculture movement at the time, they loved Stranger in a Strange Land. And it became a bestseller because he appealed to these people. Which is interesting considering where we see his politics moving, at least at this time period. He would later go on through life where he had a series of health issues. He had a condition, peritonitis, where he would have an infection in his abdomen, and it would require him getting multiple transfusions of a rare blood type. He was A2 negative, which I've never heard of, but apparently is exceedingly rare. But because of this, he became well known for like launching blood drives, and he would like go around the country and have all these blood drives to donate blood, and it became something he was really passionate about. He also, so he would go on to write in this period several different novels. He would have health issues. He would be one of the people who to receive like one of the first. I think he had a blocked artery, and he had a bypass to correct it. And he was one of the first people to ever get that surgery. And then after that, he rebounded and wrote like another 8 novels at the very end of his life. So he was quite prolific. I won't go through all of them, but I think a couple other things to note about him that I think was really interesting. He coined several phrases that have like entered our lexicon. Some of these were quite surprising. So tell me if you've ever heard of this. There's a term called Waldo, which apparently is used for like a set of robotic arms that are able to be manipulated remotely.
Interesting.
It's called a Waldo. He coined that term. He coined the term grok, which like to grok something.
Okay, got it.
You know what I mean? He invented that, which is now the term for like the AI, I think, on Twitter.
That's what I thought of immediately. Yeah.
No, but like somebody groks something. That was his terminology. He came up with that. That's literally from Stranger in a Strange Land. It's in that book. Obviously, the term Space Marine, it was an existing term, but he popularized it, and the concept was made famous by Starship Troopers. Although it's notable that the term Space Marine does not appear in the novel.
Yeah, it's like implied. Yeah.
Yeah, and then two other ones that are both massive. So one is speculative fiction.
What?
He coined that term. He wrote an essay that was called like On Speculative Fiction, in which he described this concept. And so this is a widely used term. I've used it many times on this podcast. I had no idea that this was from Heinlein.
No idea. Yeah.
And then another one that I found really surprising. I don't think he necessarily coined the term, but he definitely popularized the idea to pay it forward. It was in one of his books. A character got, I think, loaned money from somebody and was like worried about being able to pay it back, and another character tells him to pay it forward to the next person who needs it. And this became actually kind of a philosophy that he wanted to follow, and it became his. He had a bunch of foundations that were about supporting other authors, and other sort of political activities. But that was his philosophy around helping other authors, and he wanted to pay it forward to the next generation. And in fact, one of his proteges that he helped immensely along the way was Ray Bradbury, who we covered very early on this podcast with Fahrenheit 451. Yeah, Heinlein was like one of his mentors.
That's awesome. Super iconic in his own right.
Yeah, so that's Heinlein. There's a lot of different controversies over his books over the years. He definitely moved far to the right as his life progressed. He was he was more libertarian though, in a sense. It's like almost like he was very pro individualism. He didn't like government. He didn't like taxation. He thought everybody should be able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and a lot of his stories were about characters doing just that. His legacy is an interesting one. There's the Heinlein Society that still exists, that his wife constructed to, quote, pay it forward. It promotes Heinlein blood drives, provides educational materials to educators, and promotes scholarly research and overall discussion of the works and ideas of Robert Heinlein. He was involved in like the space program. I saw that he was on the broadcast. I forget, it was like one of the major broadcasts that was covering the moon landing. He was one of the guests during the moon landing.
Wow.
And was like commentating on it because he was that well known. Because what Stranger in a Strange Land becoming the best-selling novel that it became, it like changed perception of sci-fi writers, and they became more of a well-known thing. He was like a celebrity author in an era before that was really a thing.
Well, especially I'm sure during the space race, like
during
around that time, like how everybody's clamoring for more material about that.
And it's funny because of the three, I feel like I hear more about Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke, but like from what I was reading, Heinlein was probably the most well sold as far as just like number of books. He was immensely popular. So we got to move on and talk about Starship Troopers. That was everything I could find about him. Starship Troopers, I did read, was originally written in response to the U.S. stopping its nuclear program, like its nuclear testing program specifically. So there was a bunch of political pressure on the U.S. to stop testing their nuclear weapons because of the ecological impacts, fallouts of the bombs. And a bunch of like left-wing people were like, we need to stop doing this. He was furious that they stopped this. He thought like it was going to put them behind. They were going to lose the Cold War. He wanted to keep it up. And so Starship Troopers was literally written as, like he said, like a jab to the leftists who had been suggesting such things. He at this point had fully gone that way, it seems like. So that's the context for this novel getting written in 1959.
Man, I wish he had seen the movie that was made out of his material.
Yeah, I clearly don't support that, but it was a complicated time, man, and like it was a new technology people were still figuring out, and I think there was a lot of like, after the bombs were dropped, right, there was a lot of people having to reckon with that and decide like how they felt about it, and it seems to me like some people went fully into like it was all justified. It's all, it was all for the greater good. And it seems like he was fully on that side of the camp, which, definitely troubling. But like, I can see why some people felt that way, I think, at the end of the war.
Sure. I can just speak from my experience. Like, I remember growing up learning about this stuff in history class and it being like sort of like a, yeah, but it was all, you know, it was all worth it. It was all necessary.
Mm-hmm.
And
That
I
was
feel
definitely
so
the
much,
prevailing idea for a long time.
so much more conflicted about that these days. And like, you know, how, I mean, just horrific. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just, it's so
Well, I've also like
complex
read
and-
stuff about how like Japan was basically ready to surrender already, and there's always been this like this thing that's been told to me that they were going to die to the last man, and it was going to be this terrible thing. But like apparently that's not true, and I don't know. It's hard untangling propaganda from facts sometimes.
Well, people and just in general, I mean, that the movie came out, right? Like Oppenheimer came out, and I think even that film is engaging with this idea of like, you know, how many more people are going to die during the war,
Sure.
and you know, on our side, on their side, and everything. And like, I don't know, it's like I said, I don't think there's any way you can look at it and be like it was a good thing. It's horrific stuff, but yeah, it's interesting also to think of like the Cold War though, because that's what we're talking about. Like the way that people were reacting. I mean, like, you know, children were being taught how to duck and cover and they're behind under there. So like a lot of fear floating around too, right? Of like not being able to keep up with the Russians and everything like that. And what
definitely
could happen.
a lot of anti-communist rhetoric coming out, you know, which like not a big fan of communism myself, but as a philosophical concept, it has some merit to it. But at the time he's writing is like, this is like McCarthyism. This is like, you can't possibly do this. So it's not surprising to me that he's casting these bugs as being pretty similar to communists. All right, man, let's get into the plot here a little bit. We're just going to do it in 2 chunks. We're going to move through it fast. A lot of stuff happens in this book, but like overall, like it's not really that important, the individual moments, as much as just kind of a holistic look at the novel. So I think we'll talk about it a little more that way. But Starship Troopers follows Johnny Rico, a young man who enlists in the Mobile Infantry, a futuristic military unit that wears powered armor suits to fight an interstellar war. The story is set in a militarized society where only those who serve in the military are granted full citizenship. Rico begins his journey as a high school student, and after graduation decides to join the Mobile Infantry against the wishes of his father, influenced by his desire to follow in the footsteps of a friend who also decides to enlist. Rico undergoes grueling boot camp training under the strict supervision of Sergeant Zim, who teaches him the harsh realities of military life. He is placed in a squad with several fellow recruits, including his friend Dizzy Flores, and quickly learns the brutal demands of combat. After completing his training, Rico is deployed to the front lines in the war against the insect-like alien species known as the arachnids or bugs. All right, so that's like probably at least half the book. Thoughts on the opening of Starship Trooper and the way that this book progresses?
My perception of what this was going to be about from the movie was kind of thrown for a loop, because a lot of it is about like day in and day out military relationships and like training, a lot of training, which that's in the film as well, but like this like grueling training, the way that they're building these characters up. It was like, I would say 3/4 of the book is kind of that, going to different classes and like going through different grueling trainings and things like that. So that's why it kind of does blend together to an extent. Like it really starts out like heavy basic training, moving into like classroom philosophy stuff, some flashbacks and seeing like why he decided to enlist. And then we get some combat back into another. Then he's like an officer training.
Yeah, he
like,
goes to officer training. Yeah.
So it's a lot of like looking at like the military as a sort of entity and like the way that you move up, and if you want to move up, and then like philosophically grappling with like what they're doing there and why they're shaping young men. And so I just didn't expect it to be so much about that as much as it was going to be about like I don't know, the film just gave me a certain lens that I thought we were going to be approaching it. So
I feel like there was a significant part that was in boot camp, but obviously the tone is different as we see it as being like hyper violent and excessively so. It's true in the book too, but it's just treated differently, right? Like it's all for your own good. But it does talk about several people dying. There's like a crazy part where they have guns that fire blanks, but every 100 rounds or so, there's like a live round in there just to keep them on their toes, which is insane.
Somebody gets shot in the butt, and they're all like, they're talking about how all the trainers who are shooting at them are such good shots that they know they're not going to get like headshotted or killed or anything like that, but it could happen. So the threat of it happening, and you're just like,
wow,
yeah, doesn't seem great.
Yeah, but we get this Sergeant Zim character. He's a pretty significant character for a while. He is the boot. What's it?
Liquor.
Boot liquor. No, what's the term I'm looking for? Boot camp. What am I thinking? Drill sergeant. He is the drill sergeant character that I feel like has become a trope that we've seen a lot over the years in different military movies. And this is where I was really thinking, like, we've talked a few times about military fiction on this podcast, specifically All Quiet on the Western Front. We talked about it quite a bit. And like I do enjoy some like military army based movies or what have you, different branches of military war fiction, right? But we talked about how in that book, like that's the way I like to approach it, that shows the tragedy of what's happening and like the brutality of what soldiers go through, and leaves you with a sense of like, I don't know that this is worth it. And leaves you like, I feel like a good war story should be anti-war. At least at the end, you should feel that way. And this, yeah, like I think a lot of the best ones are that way, right? Or at the very least, should leave you feeling very conflicted about whether or not it's worth it.
Yeah, and that makes me think about like what this story like ultimately left me with was like, really, when you strip out all of that and you make it about like the honor and the heroic nature of it, and there are elements of that for sure, but when you strip out all that other stuff, you end up with a story that does feel like sort of propaganda and pro-war,
super propaganda,
in a major way.
Because if you think about it, it's like the whole system is designed to chew you up, and the idea is that you have to go through it in order to earn your franchise, your place in society. And I think that's notable, right? Like, you don't have a vote while you are enlisted. You only get it when you complete your enlistment. So not only are we asking these people to fight and die for us, but they don't even get enfranchisement while they're doing it. They are completely at the whims and control of the state. And in fact, there's like a whole part where a character's pushing back because he gets like cheap shotted by a superior. And of course it's like made out to be kind of silly. Like, we don't feel a lot of sympathy for the guy because of the way he's describing it. But like, the whole idea is that he's daring to push back on the idea that someone of authority can just like beat him with impunity, basically. And they're like, oh no, that's the fundamental rules in which we all agree to, is that anybody who is above you is allowed to like beat the shit out of you and dominate you anytime they want. That's the system. And the book upholds this system and like shows it to be, or tries to show it to be like the way things should be. This is like how you create men from boys. Many people die in this process, right? And like never get to that part. So like there's just so much, discomfort I have around this idea that only once you've successfully completed this do you get enfranchisement. And like, even if you want to take away, yes, obviously I disagree with the system, but like this book would also have you believe that you only like are worthy of respect even once you've gone through all of this.
Yeah. They make a point of talking about how like, why not just have everyone forcibly enlisted too? And they talk about how like, well, if you do it to the cowardly and you force it down their throats, like they're not going to be receptive of it and they're going to resist it the whole way. And so we're looking for the only ones who really truly deserve it are the ones who are brave enough and want this. And like that, yeah, that kind of bends it, right? It kind of pushes it into that. Well,
territory. It also like, it emphasizes violence. In fact, there's like a whole part that talks about how violence is like the only way things have ever been achieved. And like, I'm not saying that there's not some truth to this concept, but the system he sets up here is truly emphasizing rule by people who are inherently capable of violence, right? Like those who are incapable or unwilling to commit acts of violence aren't going to be able to do this kind of service. Now, yes, maybe there's other roles they could have gone into, you could argue, but this really focused on this military service. And I don't know. I've always felt like any sort of system that is like cutting out, the pacifists among us, the peacekeepers, the people who want cooler heads to prevail. You're really doing yourself a disservice when you start cutting those people out, because there needs to be like, I think, a natural counterbalance to those of us who are more likely to rise to a physical altercation.
Yeah, it's interesting because this story also made me like think about, of course, we're so trapped in our American view of this too, where there are countries where you're like conscripted and like you're told that you're like you must serve. That's like part of being a citizen of that country. If you're, I believe, I don't know if it's everyone, but definitely young men. And like, so if you're forcibly brought into it, like I wonder how someone from that background would view this story.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure it varies, but it's funny because as much as this book doesn't seem to like the idea of conscription, I did read that I think he was someone who signed a letter, like a famous letter that appeared in a magazine, one of the sci-fi magazines that was like pro Vietnam War. So apparently he was pro that, which I think is our last draft we had. So anyway, let's move on to the second half of the book, unless there's any other parts you want to talk. Actually, let's talk a little bit about Little Carmen, because this is like one of the only women characters we get. So I think it's worth focusing on her a little bit. She's introduced as someone that they know in school, him and his friend. She is kind of like she dates a lot of guys, but doesn't want to have any like long-term relationships with anybody. Definitely sort of objectified as being hot and someone that they all like desire. She signs up and wants to be a pilot, which is the like classic path for women in this sort of armed service in this world. And she departs and kind of goes off to do that while Rico gets assigned to the mobile infantry. They will later reconnect when she comes back around. But like, what were your initial thoughts on her and just how she served as a character in this book?
I mean, I thought that it was interesting. I noted that I didn't think she was going to come back around. I thought that she was just going to be the motivation, because he like wasn't even sure that he was going to sign up. He was like walking in and he was like, I don't know, I guess I'll see how it goes.
Well, there's the whole thing with his father, which we should talk about, where like his father was like a rich, kind of elite.
They're very well off,
he's a businessman, right? And he really wants him to follow in his steps and like not go into public service at all. And he's like, this is a foolish thing you're doing.
It specifically said that like the girl like hangs out with him to hang out at their big Olympic pool and all this other stuff too. Like, so
yeah, he's supposed to be quite wealthy. I think at one point it says that his father could buy the whole school.
Yeah. So there's that going on, and I think like when he goes in, it's interesting to see like the peer pressure, like the influence of like as they go in, they're like, one guy's like, I'm gonna work in intelligence or whatever or technology, and then she's like, I'm gonna be a pilot, and he's like, well, I don't really know. I guess I'll just kind of see where I end up, and then they push him to infantry, and then his teacher's all excited about him being in the infantry because that's where he was, and
Mr.
it's kind of pulling for him. But it gives this guy an identity that is interesting to think about. Where like I think a lot of young men seek identity in certain ways and like, oh, my rich father and this, and they push back against like, their reaction to their family in a way.
So I have seen that a lot of people who are enlisted or who are veterans like the depiction of the process of going through boot camp, because I think this is definitely an experience a lot of people have. I've heard a lot of people talk about this, right, where it provides structure, it provides order to their day, and it provides a framework to live their life that they carry with them even after their service, right? Like
it's a discipline thing too.
A discipline thing. And I think Heinlein captures that pretty well in this book. And I think even though it is like a future space kind of thing, I think a lot of veterans like that about this book from what I was reading that too.
Sure. I can definitely see
also
that.
Just tracks with, how I assume things go. All right, let's move into the second half here. Rico's first combat mission is disastrous as his unit faces overwhelming bug forces. Despite the loss of many comrades, Rico survives and begins to rise through the ranks of the mobile infantry, becoming a squad leader. Over time, he experiences more combat and is sent on various missions, each involving large-scale battles against the arachnids on different planets. As the war progresses, Rico is promoted to the officer rank and continues to fight in major battles. Along the way, he faces significant personal losses, including the deaths of friends like Dizzy, and eventually the war reaches a critical point, and Rico takes part in a final assault on the Bug homeworld, a desperate mission to strike at the heart of the arachnid threat. In the end, Rico reflects on his experience and the brutal nature of the conflict. Though he remains committed to the fight in his role in the military, the novel closes with him leading another mission, with the war far from over. So yeah, this is the thing that's like, throughout this book, there was never a moment where he questioned the system.
Nope.
There's never a moment where something was unfair or something got somebody killed and he didn't agree with it, or he felt like he was being used or taken advantage of. And that's the kind of thing that, like, I was shocked. Like, I feel like every story I've read about the military, there's gotta be some of that in there, because that's like such a frequent occurrence.
I'm sure it's just relatable, right? I'm sure that most people who go through that are going to have some sort of doubt, and that's relatability. But I think Heinlein set out to write,
or someone who tragically can't hack it, and like the conflict or the way we should feel about it. Whereas this book is like, they can't hack it and they don't deserve to.
Well, I think he set out to write the story of the perfect soldier being brought up, and this perfect scenario of why he is the way, why he eventually climbs the ranks and becomes the ultimate badass. And I think, like, I can see a certain type of person reading this and like identifying with that and being like, that's aspirational. But at the same time, like you said, like, I think the nuance that I would want in that story is, like, I think it's aspirational for somebody to at least be like questioning it too. Like do it like with reluctance or something, and still like, if you truly believe that it's for the greater good or whatever, like, you know, it's not that it's without difficulty, you know, like you said, friends dying, all that kind of stuff, like those things happen in war. So it's interesting, like, those things happen, but they don't seem to strike our character all that much, and it doesn't cause any sort of like internal conflict or struggle. It's more so just like, by the end of it, it's almost like a numbing, like it continues to get more numb to it.
He has a bloodthirst for killing these bugs, and we, you know, bugs is like is a term that, I mean, I want to use the term dehumanizes, but of course they're aliens, so they're not human. But like, it casts them
Otherizes,
as not being like people, and yet so much of what we've seen is a society. We've seen a culture, like, we hear about this, right? And yet he is almost like giddy at the prospect of murdering many of them with bombs, with you know, all kinds of, you know, even civilians. He seems to have no qualms about murdering.
A major thing that we haven't touched on is that, like, his home, Buenos Aires, where he's from, is like blown up. He thinks his mom and dad are dead. His mom
it's kind
is
of a
definitely
just
dead.
war in that sense. Like, we're defending Earth.
He's got some sort of motivation to then be like bloodlust, you know, just like, I'll go to the 7 layers of hell or whatever and back.
And it seems like there is no interest in learning anything about the bugs, about the arachnids, and like, in fact, that would be a liberal thing to do. So screw that. We just need to kill them all, you know?
That's the thing that surprised me too, is like, there's no, because we're just from the ground soldier's perspective and they have to just trust whatever the system is doing.
Yeah.
We have to think maybe there was some level of negotiations that went on, possibly. But this character is not even, I'd be thinking about it. I'd be like, I wonder if there was any way that we could, you know, end this conflict and have our friends stop dying. But it's like, it's going in the opposite direction. It's getting more, and the character's getting more involved and more motivated.
There was talk about prisoner exchanges and like wanting to do prisoner exchanges, but how like the bugs don't care about their own, so you can't exchange people for them. But that did also imply that they are taking human prisoners, which again is like, that's telling me something, right? Like, they're not just killing everybody; they're taking prisoners.
They're not just like animalistic, instinctual beings. Like, there's a thought process going on there.
Yeah,
for
it
sure.
seems that way.
And just talking about his father as well, I thought there's an interesting commentary there with, like, his father is so against the war, and then the bombing happens, and then his father jumps into the war, and how, like, he almost feels like his son is vindicated. Like, his son is like, that's what the story is telling me, at least, is that, like, the son was right all along.
The son was right all along. The father is now learning from the son. Yeah.
And that's weird to me, because I always feel like, and this is just, again, from the war stories I've read and engaged with, and then I've known people in the military. I feel like most people who go through any of this kind of stuff don't want their children. They want to do it so that their children don't have to go through it. And it is interesting to see this sort of like the familial thing where it's like generations of people who go into the military, like if necessary, like it is an honorable thing. But at the same time, like, I think each generation is hoping that it's their kid doesn't have to go. That's why they're there.
You could argue that humanity is in a time of war here, has been attacked on the home world, Buenos Aires being destroyed, essentially, from what we heard. So it complicates things a little bit, I guess. And you know, this is someone who lived through World War II, so was very familiar with like a world-threatening.
Not to mention,
event.
like you said, very legacy sort of. Yeah. You know,
whole family going all the way back to the Revolutionary War. It sounds like.
Yeah.
So I wanted to note also towards the end we get this revelation that Rico is in fact of Filipino descent and can speak Tagalog. And I was like, it was just funny how it was presented, because I think it was pretty clear to me that this was supposed to be like a twist. And I guess in 1959 it was. From what I was reading, like this was considered kind of, surprisingly like supposed to shake you to your core, and here you thought this guy was a white guy all along, but he's actually a Filipino. But that just kind of shows that like he is someone who valued this in a sense, right? To include it in the book. Like he didn't have to do that, but he decided he wanted to do it. He wanted there to be a revelation. He knew that a lot of his readers were going to be white Americans who would be sort of shocked by this. It's so quaint by today's standards, and it's like laughable, I would say, at this point. But
yeah.
I think in context, it is something to note, is that this was considered a kind of surprising twist.
I thought that there was, and I thought that throughout the story it was like multi-ethnic, like there was a bunch of different races being represented and stuff. And I'm not saying that they were done well.
From everything I saw, he was not racist, and in fact, he often, I mean, like he had some prejudice, it seems like, against groups that like America was at war with, like many people did who came up in those eras. But like overall, he believed in equality among races, and he really seemed like he valued meritocracy. Now, I have only done, again, only so much research, so I might be completely wrong about that. There might be evidence that people have directly of him being incredibly racist, and it wouldn't shock me to hear, especially later in his life from what I was seeing. But also, it seems like he like barely wanted to engage with the idea of like homosexuality. Like he's not like against it, but like it's just not very present in any of his works. Gets hinted at a little bit about like relationships between women in some of the books, but rarely ever engages with the idea of what relationships between men. There might be some books that it touches on it a little bit. So it's kind of unknown what his like personal feelings were around that, other than he seems to not engage with it a ton, just as a subject.
Interesting. So
it's hard. It's one of those things. It's hard to know.
Yeah, like that from that far back, I can understand the taboos around that at the time for sure.
Yeah. So one other thing, we'll put a cap on this, but one thing I thought was notable is that he had a famous house in Colorado Springs.
Nice.
James and I just went to Colorado Springs for James's bachelor party, so I thought that was funny when I saw that. It was so famous for all his like modern gadgets and stuff he had in it that it got this whole write-up in Popular Mechanics magazine, where they went inside his house and like showed off all of his gadgets and stuff. It wasn't actually his most famous house, because after that house, and after Stranger in a Strange Land came out, he got super rich, and he moved to California, and he built this, like, they called it the launch pad. It was this like big circular house that was super new, like space age looking, and had all kinds of fancy gadgets, even more fancy than this. But he had a home, at least for a while, in Colorado Springs, which I thought was funny considering we had just gone there.
Yeah, I mean, it's wild to see what people do with their money when they get there.
Yeah. If anything, like you could argue it wasn't necessarily age, but I'm sure that plays a role. But like, I think wealth also affected him politically, which I think that we have seen plenty of times in the past, right? Like the wealthier he got, the more right wing he got.
I can't wait to watch this movie next week. I am also like thinking a lot like legacy wise now about this story, and like, if this is truly the first time we're seeing like exosuits, is this also the first time we're seeing like fully encased? Like, is this like Iron Man and Mecha, like Gundam that. And stuff? Like, I think all
so.
that.
I think so. I'm not like a historian on this, but from what I was seeing, yes. So a lot of this goes back to that. We got to wrap things up, man. We'll return next week for the movie. It's Verhoeven. It's a satire. I'm curious to see how it holds up. I saw it when I was probably 12 or 13. Maybe I saw it one or two times after that, but still when I was young. Haven't seen it in many years, so excited to revisit it. Thank you to the patrons who voted for this. We really appreciate your support. If you like this episode, please let us know in the form of a rating and review on whatever app you chose to listen on. If you're on YouTube, make sure to subscribe to our channel, like the video, and leave us a comment. Recommend another Heinlein project. If there's another adaptation you know about that you'd like to hear us talk about, we'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, and be sure to connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, TikTok. We're adding to film on all those platforms, and really anywhere else you could look.
And if you'd like to support this podcast in another way, we do have that Patreon where you can support us monetarily. You get the option to vote on upcoming projects. We do have another Patreon selection coming up later this year. You also get monthly bonus episodes on there. We just put out one that was like us catching up with a bunch of former guests at Worldcon. So that was a special one that if you wanted to have access to that for as little as like $2, you can get access to that. Also, I noticed you can buy specific posts on there for like a set amount. That's a new thing Patreon's allowing. So if you don't want to like have the ongoing support, but you are curious about a specific thing we have out, you can go find that and just buy that one thing. So we welcome people to do that if that's what you're interested in.
Definitely, yeah. And thank you to Russ Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music.
All right, that's going to be it, man. We got to enlist. We got to go suit up and get ready to fight the bugs.
Yeah.
As Heinlein would want it.
Yeah. I'm going to at least be questioning my higher ups as we do this.
Of course, yeah. We got to stay true to ourselves as well.
We're going to be very intentional.
All right, man. That's going to be it for this week. So until next time,
keep adapting.